Okay, so the last thing that we want to talk about here is something called operating leverage. And this is a decision that the firm or the management team needs to make, both on a firm level basis, but also on a project level basis. And it's a decision that we're going to make right at the start whenever we consider a project, but also it's something we're going to do on an ongoing basis as well. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a little bit. So what operating leverage tells me is, to what degree does a firm or the project actually produce, like make its own product? Or to what degree does it buy a mostly finished product and then just assemble it? So you can think about the extremes here. And again, I always think thinking about the extreme cases is a very useful way to understand distinctions in these kinds of big problems. But the most extreme example of a firm with really high operating leverage is a firm that makes every single piece and part of its product on its own. And the opposite would be a firm that buys all of the finished pieces and just assembles it and sells it. So if we go back to our bike example, I could, for instance, have like a smelter and a caster and like actually cast all of the metal pieces that go into making bikes, the sprockets and the chains, produce all of those, and produce the tires from a rubber plant, and so my inputs are all the very most basic inputs, the raw metal, the raw rubber. I produce everything, assemble everything, and then sell finished bicycles. The flip side of that coin is someone who doesn't produce any of that stuff on their own. Their inputs are finished materials that they just only assemble, right? So I don't make the tires, I don't make any of the metal parts. I buy finished frames and finished wheels and finished brake assemblies. I put them all together, assemble them, and then sell the finished product. Now, you can probably imagine that these two firms are going to look pretty different from each other, right? A firm that has the capability to manufacture and produce all of its finished product is going to have a significantly higher requirement of fixed assets and fixed costs. If I can make my own tires out of raw rubber and cast my own bike frames and handlebars out of raw metal, the machine and equipment that I require and the space and employees that I'm going to need are much more are going to be much more significant than a firm that just buys all this finished product, assembles it into a bike. Right? That can be done by one person in a pretty quick amount of time. So the level of fixed assets I require in that case is relatively small in comparison. Now, this is an important thing for firms because it is going to help determine how firms are able to perform in different economic cycles. And that means that a firm with a higher proportion of fixed costs, meaning they have more operating leverage, they're going to be better able to make high profits when times are good. But because they have a higher percentage of fixed costs, they're going to be worse off when times are bad. And we can see this with a simple example. So over here on the left in the red, we have a firm with high fixed costs, so they have high operating leverage. And in the blue on the right is a firm with low fixed costs, so they have low operating leverage. Now, these aren't extreme examples, they're not that different, but you can imagine that the firm with low operating leverage mostly assembles their products, and the firm with high operating leverage mostly builds everything from scratch, manufactures everything from scratch. So we can see that in the normal case, these two firms are producing and generating sales in about the same amount. So they have 16 million in sales. Their variable costs are going to be different because the firm with high fixed costs is going to have lower variable costs because they buy raw material. Raw iron and metal and raw rubber is a lot cheaper than a firm that is buying finished tires and finished frames. So the low fixed cost firm in the blue, they got higher variable costs because they're buying finished inputs instead of raw inputs. But the flip side is going to be on their fixed costs. The firm with high fixed costs is going to be the one that's producing all of these, or manufacturing all these raw material into finished inputs. And so they're going to need more space, they're bigger warehouses, more machinery, more employees. Their fixed costs are going to be higher. So the trade-off is, do you want higher fixed costs or higher variable costs? Depreciation is the same for both these firms. And then we look at pre-tax profit. In the normal scenario for both of these, it's the same. $550,000. And then their operating cash flow of $1 million for both firms. Now, where the change comes in from these two is not in the normal times, because they're about the same in the normal times. It's in the boom and the bust. Or here, the boom and the slump. Right? In the slump, I have lower sales. In the boom, I have higher sales. So if we look at the slump, I have lower sales, 13 million instead of 16 million. Now, with my high operating leverage firm, my high fixed cost firm, my fixed costs don't change. My variable costs shrink, right? But what they don't do is shrink enough to cover my fixed costs not falling enough. So I still have to pay all my salaries, still have to pay all my my rental expense on my big costs on my big warehouse and all the machinery expenses and all that. So my variable costs do fall because they are lower, but they don't fall enough to offset my falling sales. And so I'm worse off if I have high operating expenses. I actually swing to a negative pre-tax profit, and I have a operating cash flow of only 437,000, down from $1 million. Where with my firm with low fixed costs, the one that buys the finished inputs, if they're selling less, they're buying less of these expensive inputs, and because their fixed costs are already less, their costs actually fall significantly, and they fall enough to offset the falling of sales. And so this firm still is going to have a positive pre-tax profit, even though they probably have a negative NPV. And we see the opposite happen for the boom. In the boom, it's the firm with high fixed costs that captures more of the additional profit. Because they're selling more and they're paying lower variable costs, they're able to capture more of the profit for themselves when they're selling more and more product. And so they end up with higher operating cash flows and pre-tax profit than their competitor that's with low operating leverage. And so what that means is that the firm's decision on operating leverage is going to determine how much of the swings in economic cycles the firm is subject to. So a firm that makes most of its finished products start to finish is going to be a firm that captures more of the profit in the good times, but also has worse outcomes in the bad times. And a firm that mostly outsources all of their production and only buys finished inputs is going to be more moderated in both of those outcomes. They're going to have smaller lows and smaller highs. And so that's a choice that the firm has to make. And there's no right or wrong necessarily. Although you might find that, in times like now, really bad times, firms with high fixed costs are going to be in a lot more trouble. And so that has led a lot of U.S. firms to do more outsourcing, to do more buying of finished inputs rather than turning raw materials into finished inputs on their own. We've seen that in lots of different industries. We've seen car companies go back and forth on this. Back in the early 1900s to the 50s, car companies made literally every single piece of the car by themselves. They were just one entity. They bought the raw materials, they turned it into cars and sold them. Then in the 70s and 80s, they started to divest all of the parts production into different separate companies. So they sold off to smaller companies the ability to make door panels and steering wheels and airbags and all that stuff. It was cheaper for them to lower their fixed cost and raise their variable cost by outsourcing the production of their inputs. And now, actually, in the last 15 years, we've seen those same car companies reverse and start to bring more of that raw input production back in-house and back into the company. So again, this is a sort of a decision that firms make on an ongoing basis. What is appropriate for us at a given time? But it's certainly something that's very relevant, for instance, right now, when we're swinging to a negative economic cycle. The firms that have a high fixed cost, high operating leverage, they're going to be in more financial difficulty because they have higher fixed costs to cover, even though they're generating lower revenues. And so the way that we can understand this without having to look at all the information together is, again, another ratio, a ratio called the degree of operating leverage. And this just measures the firm's operating leverage given different operating cash flows. And the formula for it is degree of operating leverage is equal to 1 plus our fixed cost divided by our operating cash flows. So in our prior example, If we look at the firm A, the one with high operating leverage, that's 1 plus $2 million worth of fixed cost divided by $1 million worth of operating cash flow. And this is in their normal scenario, so $16 million worth of sales. Gives us a degree of operating leverage of 3. Now, how do we understand this ratio? What does it mean to say we have a degree of operating leverage of 3? Well, what it means is that for every dollar of additional sales, how many dollars of additional operating cash flow am I going to generate? And so when I have a high degree of operating leverage, when I have high fixed costs, when my sales go up, my profit goes up by 3. So my sales go up by $1. I have operating cash flow increase of $3, which is great. I'm turning my sales into real profit. But the flip side is also true here. If my sales fall by $1, my operating cash flows fall by $3. So again, with a high degree of operating leverage, when this ratio is greater than 1, then we are going to see more significant swings for this company. They're going to do way better in good times and way worse in bad times. And now we'll work a couple of examples here to finish off the chapter. So you can jump to the examples now. But other than that, that's all I have for chapter 11. I hope you guys are staying safe out there. I hope you guys are keeping up with the lectures. And we'll see you next week.